It's so much harder. It's awesome. In this video, I'm gonna be teaching you how to get industry standard professional sounding drums using an objective approach. I'm calling this video 6 steps to an objectively professional drum mix. This works for any genre in any mix. First, checking phase and polarity. That's there. Regardless of our genre, we still need to check phase and polarity. Second one is gain staging drums. We definitely need to gain stage our drums to ensure that our plugins are operating at their optimal level, as well as we're not just overblowing our mix. We're gonna be using compression to control our drums dynamics and make them awesome and punchy and powerful and all those good traits. We're gonna be using EQ to clean up our drums and obviously make them punch and cut through the mix well. 5 is we're gonna be talking about drum bus processing, how to process your drum bus so that it always sounds pro. And then also number 6 is effects, how to use effects effectively in your drums to get the most out of them. Phase is essentially time-based, polarity is directional based. And I know that this is not the scientific definition of these terms. However, it is the functional definition that you can take and actually utilize in your mixes today. So let's talk about polarity first. In this example, we have a kick in and a kick out, and they are basically the same signal, right? They're miking the same instrument. We have the first one, the kick in, is going down on its very biggest peak. And on the bottom, it's going up on its very biggest peak. What this is going to do, if we overlap these, is they're going to cancel each other out because they're exact opposites. And ultimately, if we have an exact opposite sound wave that hits itself, we are then going to end up with nothing inside of mix. Phase now. So phase, as I mentioned earlier, is time-based. Basically, if we have a kick in, a kick out, and they're directionally correct this time, right? So the polarity is not the issue. However, as you can tell, there's still some cancellation going on here because at a different part of the sound, it is now going down, the other part is going up, and therefore we're still gonna end up with this cancellation result. And so this is ultimately what it looks like when you have a phase issue inside of your kick drum. Okay, so let's demonstrate this real quick in an EDM mix. So this is a song called Fly by my good friend Sonics. Go check out the full song if you want to, because it is epic. The mix though, I actually added this kick too just to demonstrate this concept in action. So if we look real closely to these two kicks, you know, on initial listen, you know, they sound all right. But when we dive in a little bit deeper and see what's actually going on here internally, we can tell there's actually a lot of phase cancellation going on here. So this is actually probably the best view. So we can tell there's cancellation going on here, right there, here, and then right there. And then it kind of gets back on track a little bit here later in the note. But ultimately, if we wanted to have this section the most punchy it possibly could be with the most low end, we want to add a gain plugin. And we want to invert this phase. So that's going to get it back in line polarity-wise with this other kick, and it's going to sound really epic now. So here is without. Here's with. So listen to the low end. That is really where you're going to hear this. It's just an additional thickness, fullness being added to this kick. In this actual mix though, this kick wasn't there, and so I'm gonna remove that. I just wanted to show you exactly what that would look like in an electronic mix. Even if you're using samples, that doesn't necessarily mean you don't have to deal with this multi-mic'd audio source issue, or rather this phase and polarity issues sources. So if anything lives in the same area, we're layering it like kick or a snare, we're going to run into these phase and polarity issues potentially. Now we're on to gain staging drums. The first thing that we need to ask ourselves is, what is gain staging to begin with? And in order to ask that question, we need to define what is gain. And so there's an issue because gain is often called volume and volume is often called gain. And these two ideas are fundamentally different. However, they are used to describe the same thing oftentimes because of where it sits in the signal chain. Let me break this down for you very simply. Gain is simply a signal going into a process, regardless of what that process is, whether it's EQ, compression, distortion, a signal chain, anything. Gain is the signal going in, volume is the signal coming out. So the goal of this process of gain staging overall, when we're talking about a signal chain, a plugin, a EQ, regardless of what it is, our goal is to have a certain level of gain going in and the same amount of volume going out. And that is measured in decibels. So if we have 10 decibels going in, we want 10 decibels coming out. So the natural question is, how do we measure this? Because there are two primary ways to measure volume or gain in a signal. It's either going to be average volume or peak volume. Only time I use peak volume is actually at the very beginning of the mix. I'm going to use peak volume to make sure that I have enough headroom in my tracks that any processing I do is not only going to be at the ideal volume for my plugins, but it's also going to leave me plenty of headroom for my mix bus and ultimately not be peaking right from the beginning and ultimately be fighting with my faders the entire mix. So I'm going to use peak volume first, but for all of processing, so EQ, compression, distortion, anything that I do on my tracks, I'm going to use average volume because average volume is what humans actually hear. We're able to better identify if our EQ, say, sounds good after the change. So if I make a change that adds volume, I want to gain stage that back down so it's still matching before and after using average volume. And because that's what I'm hearing, I'm able to then make a more objective decision whether that change was good or bad, because I'm not going to be inclined towards the decision that made the volume higher. The next stage is, where do you actually gain stage in your mix? And I kind of alluded to this. The first place is the raw tracks. Before we start mixing, we need to gain stage our raw tracks or our raw regions inside of our tracks. We want to gain stage EQ, compression, and any effects that we add to the drums as well. So let's dive into gain staging raw tracks. The first rule that you need to understand when gain staging raw tracks is that your peak volume, right? This is the only time we use peak volume in the mix. The peak volume should be between minus 10 decibels and minus 20 decibels. The reason why we do this is that plugins sound ideal when our tracks are within this range. Some hits are going to be quieter, some are going to be louder. However, within that general range, the plugins are going to operate at their optimal capacity because that is how manufacturers designed their plugins to work. Oftentimes I get mixes from students, and this is the first thing that often comes up is that their tracks are peaking at minus 2 decibels, minus 1 decibel, and ultimately our plugins can't deal with that kind of gain going into it. It's just overwhelming it. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose, literally. And your plugins are the ones trying to drink from it, and they just can't do it. They can't handle that much signal going in. So if we actually lower the signal going in and we use a normal garden hose, now they can actually drink it just fine and ultimately deal with our tracks at their optimal capacity. Okay, so our next step is to gain stage these drums. So let's make sure that we're doing that properly. Again, functions, normalize region gain, normalize that down to 12 decibels. I've actually already done that in this mix, but make sure you're doing that as well. Most of the time, these kicks are just like crazy loud. So we want to make sure that we're actually gain staging them down so they're an appropriate level so that in the context of the entire mix, we can easily mix it well. So here is the entire mix. And we can tell on our Axis stereo out right now, we still have a lot of headroom. We have over 7 decibels of headroom to work with. So we're sitting at a really good spot. We can just mix, we can gain stage as we go, and we're very confident that it's not going to clip and we're not going to run into those issues. Okay, so now we're diving into drum compression. So the very first thing that we're going to cover is shell dynamic goals, the shell being the kick, the snare, and the toms. The first one is just consistency. You need these to be ultra consistent in the mix, especially for a modern feel for a mix, because we want to be able to hear every single, shadow hit on the snare and every single kick, that even if they're doing some little double pedal action, that their left leg is a little bit weaker than their right leg, we can still hear that occurring inside of the mix. So the first goal is always consistency. The second goal is going to be impact and energy, to make sure that we have this fullness sounding, but also that punch that comes from a well-mixed kick or snare or tom. So what are the common issues with shell dynamics? These are going to relate to the goals, generally speaking, because if the goals aren't met, they're an issue. So the first one is macro dynamic variation. You can tell the first hit is very weak, the second two are very strong. So ultimately we don't have very good macro dynamic variation. Macro dynamics being the overall note to note variation, and micro dynamics being the individual relationship between the tail and the transient of the note, which we're we're going to dive into a little bit more here in a second. So the next issue that we have with shell dynamics is lack of beefiness or weight behind those, the kick or the snare or the toms. And then the last one is lack of impact and punch to make sure that it's poking out, it's forward, and ultimately has that nice punch that we're looking for. Let's dive into the actual shell compression chain. I'm going to be talking about types of compression. If you don't know the types or styles of compression, make sure you're getting the compression style guide down below. There's a link in the description and also likely in a pinned comment that you can download this guide for free. So let's dive into the first stage of the compression, which is consistent type compression and also gain staging. We've already talked about gain staging, and so I'm not going to cover that. However, consistent type compression can definitely play a role in this particular mix because we definitely have a lot of variation in our tracks variation in our kicks and the snares and toms that we likely want to control. Okay, so now we're diving into thickness type compression here. The goal of this type of compression is to decrease the transient and increase the tail, which is ironic because this is rather counterintuitive to what we actually want, generally speaking, with our drums. We want very strong transients and very weak tails because that's what's going to create that impact and punch. But thickness is a really great way to just make our drums beefier and fatter, and then we're going to deal with the impact and punch for the next style of compression. Okay, so the next type of compression that we're going to be adding to these drums is punchy type compression. So punchy type compression is increasing the transient and decreasing the tail of the notes. This is very intentional because I can just balance this perfectly with the thickness and the punchy type compression. If I want more thickness, I can just add more thickness type compression, or if I want the drums to be more punchy, I can just add more punchy type compression. So I can just balance these perfectly because we're decreasing the transient with the thickness and then increasing the transient with the punchy. I can just balance it exactly as I want to with my shell. If you're struggling to get that industry standard quality for your mixes, then go ahead and check out my book, The Objective Mix. It teaches you the objective standards of how to get an industry standard quality mix. There's a link in the description if you are interested in that. Let's get back to the video. In this case, because this kick is so consistent already, we don't actually need to add any consistency type compression. And instead, I'm gonna jump straight into the thickness type compression. So this kick alone is already relatively thick, but I do think that there's an extra layer of just oomph that we can add to it by adding this. We're going to be using a 0 knee. We're going to use a very fast attack and a very fast release, and then our ratio is going to be starting to 3-to-1. Again, I might go a little higher with that depending on how aggressive I end up getting with this kick. And that's significantly louder, so let's pull up our level meter, and we're measuring RMS. So no, minus 22 without. So minus 1.5 decibels. So just adding that extra layer of just oomph to that kick. Okay, and so then the next stage of compression is gonna be adding some punchy style compressions. So in this case, I'm gonna be using a longer attack and then a longer release to really dial in that tail, right? So I'm gonna be decreasing that tail, increasing the transient. All right, so let's gain stage this real quick. Here's without. Okay, so 0.5 decibel. All right, so here's without any compression on the kick. All right, that sounded great to me. Let's move on to the snare here. And the snare has kind of similar issues here. Make sure we gain stage this. Okay, so it's minus 32 with the compression. Minus 31, so we can get another 0.5 decibel out of this. Yeah, so it's just kind of like that beefiness that's being brought out with this compression. I like that. All right, and let's get a little bit more punchy style here. Right, here's without. So it's pretty subtle, but there's just additional thickness, additional power out of this snare. I like it. Again, I'm not getting a ton of gain reduction. I'm not compressing these elements a ton in this mix. Because these are synthetic instruments, because these are samples, we don't need a ton of additional dynamic control. It's just stylistic, just to nudge it in the right direction a little bit to get the character that we want out of these elements. So let's go to this percussion. So this one's interesting because it has, a lot of other samples added to it. Right, so in this case, I want to get a little bit more consistency because these are really loud peaks right here, and then this is going to be quieter over here. So overall, I just want to bring those up, bring the other fill down a little bit, and then I'm going to end up with a really nice sounding kind of hi-hat piece to our overall drum kit here. Consistency is going to be a fast attack, slow release. Because it's really loud. Okay, so minus 32 basically. Minus 31, so we got a little bit too much gain going on. Yeah, there we go. I want to bring up these hats more. And then the build-up drums. Let's see what we got. Yeah, I think a little bit of thickness would do them good. So let's add that thickness compressor. I don't think these need any more punchiness. I really just think additional thickness is going to do them some good. EQ for drums. So let's get started. The first one we're going to cover is kick. The first problem that we have with kick is a low rumble. So the low rumble is going to be in this region right here, but anything below 35 hertz, you really can't hear in a kick anyway. We just don't need this information in the kick. The next EQ move that we're going to want to pursue is the fundamental of the kick. So this is the core fundamental of the kick. Generically speaking, we want to emphasize this because this is where the core sound of that low end of the kick actually lives. Okay, so the next one that we're going to want to deal with is any masking that is occurring inside of the kick. In a bass, you'll have a fundamental of the bass somewhere in this low region, right? Biting with the kick exactly. And so we want to deal with this masking going on because the kick right here, as you can see, is masking all of that area that is the fundamental of the bass, which the fundamental of the bass right in this case is 70 hertz. So we're not actually done with masking quite yet. The kick also lives in this upper region, right? So 125 to 500 hertz. And sometimes it's actually very, very present in this region. That not only sounds generally kind of wooden sounding. When we're looking at this region though, we also want to look at the rest of the mix. So the guitar's living here, the vocals are living here, the bass is also living here. And so essentially we're just running into all these items that would better serve them rather than the kick. So we just want to move the kick out of the way of those elements in the mix. All right, so the next issue or next move that we're going to want to pursue with the kick is the definition of the kick. So the definition will live in this range somewhere with all kicks. Most of the time I find people trying to boost in this 3K range a lot with kicks, even though the 3K range is kind of the magic frequency of bringing stuff forward, which again is the reason why everybody's boosting here, because it brings the kick forward in the mix and makes them feel like the kick is right up front where it needs to be. However, it's also going to be introducing excess harshness in the mix, and also it prevents you from boosting other elements there, and then you're going to cause additional masking, such as the lead vocal will generally sound really good in that 3K range. However, kick, obviously, if we're boosting the kick in that range, end up fighting with all those other elements. Okay, so our next area for the EQing the snare is the meat of the snare, and so that's really going to be looking at this fundamental of the snare. So I will almost always boost right below the fundamental because I want even more of that just body, that like oomph of the snare. Okay, so the next one that we're going to be dealing with is harmonics. So in this case, we have a very distinct harmonics happening, and you can hear that ringing, and that's really these harmonics at work just ringing out. It's the tone of the snare. And in this case, a kind of a nice desirable quality, depending on what we're going for. If we're going for a very, kind of retro sounding snare, generally we're going to leave these harmonics in there. If you want a very dry, modern snare sound, then you're going to want to cut these out. All right, so the next one we're going to be running into is snap, crackle, and pop. So this is really where the just aggressive, that crack of the snare comes in, and I couldn't find another analogy for this characteristic of the snare other than breakfast cereal. So this is where the crack comes in. The last one is brightness and sizzle. So this is going to be the brightness of the snare, all of that top end information. Oftentimes you'll hear a lot of modern snares especially being boosted here heavily because it gets that nice crispy quality out of the snare. Now we're going to be diving into EQ, all of these elements. Again, all we're doing is finding that fundamental, removing noise, and following the other steps that we've outlined. So let's start with if there's any just noise that we need to remove in this. So there's a little bit of noise down there. So I'm gonna go ahead and just cut that out. Yeah, there we go. A little bit more focus in that low end. All right, and now we're gonna find that fundamental, which is right at this 65 hertz. Delicious. Okay, so the next stage is these harmonics. So there's a really strong harmonic right here. And that's roughly actually a really nice character in the kick in solo. However, let's check out our bass because we might actually be ending up running over our bass a little bit. So here's that. So there's a little bit in that range, but really not very much. I'm not too concerned about that range because that bass is so low. Let's check out the other top of the bass. So yeah, there's a little bit in that 125 hertz, but nothing in that 100 hertz, which is really where this kick is living. So I'm gonna let that 100. Well, I guess that's 125. Let's cut right at that 130. Let's get that out of the way. Okay, cool. And then on our bass top, we're going to do, again, because we've identified some masking going on. So right at that 100 hertz range, I'm gonna cut and then boost right at that 120, 150. I also notice there's some kind of low end here. Just don't want to we want to make sure that stays out of the way of the kick fundamental. So we're gonna just cut there. All right, that kick is really cutting through now in earnest, so that's awesome. So now we got to deal with the kind of the muddy middle. And we can tell there's quite a bit in this lower region here. And And so on first listen, you know, some of that character is actually kind of nice, but we have a lot of other things living in this range. So I'm just going to do a slight cut, get it out of the way, because you're not really going to hear most of that character cut through the mix anyway once we're done EQing here. All right, and let's find out our last little move here, which is going to be the forwardness, the harshness isn't really applicable in this kick. This sounds pretty good to me. And then we just want to probably bring out a little bit of that beater, that definition of the kick a little bit. All right, so let's gain stage this here real quick. Here's without. Okay, so 21. So we could probably lose half a decibel or so. All right. So here we are before. So it's just a little bit deeper, a little bit more focused, and ultimately is cutting through the mix ever slightly more. Again, because these are samples, they don't need that much processing to really get in the right spot. All right, so now let's dive into the EQ for our snare. Okay, so again, rules do not change. We're gonna be boosting slightly at this fundamental. Delicious. So now we're looking for some harmonics. So there's definitely a very strong harmonic right here. And then right here. And then right there. So again, this is based on our goals. Do we want this snare to kind of ring out a little bit, or do we want to really just cut all of those harmonics out and make the snare really dead? It's kind of up to us. I really don't like cutting that. It sounds weak. Yeah, I think I'm going to leave most of that as is. I think I'm just going to do a very broad cut down here in this region. And then that snap, crackle, pop area. Just bring that up ever so slightly. And then some more air. And there's definitely a little bit of low end here, so that. And then for these percussive elements, let's dive into here. So it's interesting, we have basically toms in this section, and then we have hi-hats in the rest of it. So I'm definitely going to bring out a little bit of that top end, because that's going to sound great with both of those elements. So there's a little harmonic there that is not super desirable. Just gonna cut that out. Other than that, it's sounding pretty good. I think it could use a little bit less mid-range. So I kind of did that out of order, but essentially, to recap what I did is I cut off the low end. I didn't think the fundamental needed to be boosted, so I left that alone. I did cut one of the harmonics in this track, and then the just muddy mid-range I cut there as well, and then boosted on the top, and that's all that's really needed with this track. I'm not really focused on this section, but we can go ahead and EQ it really fast. So again, there's kind of all this mud. We don't really need that. So that's kind of the fundamental. Let's bring that out a little bit. And then back off just the mid-range. We're gonna need to gain this down. Here we go. Okay, so now we're diving into the drum bus. And here's my go-to bus compression chain without any further ado. I'm gonna be adding is a thickness type compression in parallel. So just a reminder, thickness type compression is decreasing the transient and increasing the tail. This is just to give the entire drum bus a little bit more meat, and then also have the entire drum bus just move in rhythm with one another. So the cymbals are being ducked a little bit by the snare and the kick, creating a lot of glue, but also some additional thickness in the drums entirely. Okay, so our next type of compression is punchy type compression. This should not be a surprise. This is just bringing up kicks and snares, just adding some more impact again overall to the kit. And this will actually add a little bit of pumping as well to the cymbals, which usually we're trying to avoid that sort of movement. However, in this case, it actually sounds really good if we hear this kind of pumping in the cymbals. It just adds more energy to the drums overall, and you'll hear it actually a lot in many drum mixes that you'll hear on the radio, especially for rock. So if you're listening to a rock mix on the radio or just on Spotify, wherever, pay attention to those drums. You're gonna hear a lot of those pumping in the cymbals. Okay, so now we're diving into drum bus EQ. Now that we've compressed the drum bus, we got to EQ it. So the first thing that we're going to be dealing with the drum bus EQ is low rumble. Again, similar to the rest of the tracks, if there's anything that made it through or the compression brought out, we want to deal with that with EQ. So that's, again, going to be in this low area around here. All right, so now we're going to deal with the fundamentals. So oftentimes we'll be boosting on these fundamentals if we feel like they could be enhanced a little bit more with our drums. So the two fundamentals that are the most key is the kick and the snare. As you can see in this image, you have the kick right at that 60 right below 60 hertz, and then the snare right at that 200 hertz. So those are going to be the key points that we may consider boosting, or just boosting this whole area, because it's also going to be allowing us to boost some of the fundamentals of the toms as well. All right, so the next thing that we're going to be dealing with is masking. Again, this middle area is the most common area that we're going to have any masking going on. So we're going to want to be very cautious about boosting here especially, but oftentimes we can do with a nice little cut here to get this out of the way of the rest of the mix. All right, and then the last one is harshness. Aggressiveness is going to be in this kind of 2 to 3K range. Again, if we want it to be more aggressive, we might end up boosting here, or if it's sounding a little bit harsh, we might be cutting here as well. All right, and then the last one is brightness, crispiness. Again, similar to everything else, the brightness and crispiness is always in this top range, 8K plus. Then you're probably already producing and mixing your own music. And if you're unable to get that professional sheen or quality or vibe for your songs, then I want to let you in on a little secret. Most mixers are trying to compensate their lack of professional mixes by getting more plugins, by using more advanced tips or tricks or techniques in their mixes, or relying on buying more professional gear in order to compensate for their lack of quality mixes. But in reality, most mixers' core problem is actually mixing subjectively, or approaching mixing from just a creative mindset entirely. Obviously, mixing is still a somewhat of a creative skill. It's actually far more objective than most people realize. Because if we think about it, everyone agrees on what a professional mix actually is. If that weren't the case, then it would be an entirely subjective field. But in reality, mixing is actually incredibly objective, because everyone agrees on what a pro song sounds like. And so mixing objectively can actually help you avoid being your own worst enemy inside of your mixes, and ultimately allow you to just check all of the boxes that a professional mix should check, and then your mix will sound objectively professional. And so if you're mixing your own music and you're motivated to actually learn the objective skill of mixing, and if you want to ensure that your music sounds pro, then I would love to help you out by teaching you the 5 objective standards that everybody is judging your mix by, and how you can use objective mixing to solve those 5 problems inside of your mix, and then also how to do all of that in under 3 hours per song without pro gear, premium plugins, or utilizing templates or presets. So this is something that piques your interest, then go to theobjectivemix.com to order my brand new book, The Objective Mix. This will teach you how to mix objectively professional mixes every single time you sit down to mix. This provides you with my entire mixing workflow, along with all of the breakthrough lessons that I've learned in the last 16 years of mixing music. So if that is interesting to you at all, then again, go to theobjectivemix.com or click the link right below this video. Can't wait to see you on the inside. With that, let's get back to the video. So this is going to be really critical in especially this mix because we're using samples from different libraries potentially, and so we want to unify them and make them feel like they're moving together inside of the mix. Especially these hi-hats, right? We want to feel some movement in those due to the kick and the snare in order to just glue all of that together. So we're going to do thickness type compression first, and then we're going to do some punchy type compression after that. Again, fast attack, fast release, I'm going to leave that alone, and then low knee, and then 3-to-1 ratio. I might raise that up depending on how much I want to do in parallel. All right, so without that, okay, minus 21. Got 3 decibels. No, 4. All right, that's sounding pretty good. That's just nice and meaty. Again, I'm gonna back this off so we're not so extreme, and we're still getting our target of no more than 3 decibels gain reduction. That kick sounds so much better with this. It's just nice and meaty and disgustingly great. So good. All right, now let's add some punchy style compression. Let's use the red 3 this time, just for funsies. Okay, so long attack, long release in order to get more of that initial transient from these drums. 3-to-1 ratio. So much more punchiness. Like, all right, so here's without. So minus 21.8. Okay, minus 23, so that's 2 decibels. Without any compression on the drum bus. And the best part is we haven't actually added any, issues with headroom. So oftentimes when we start compressing and we're not really paying attention to our gain staging, we end up losing a lot of headroom. In this case, we haven't actually lost that much. So I know that we're doing a really great job with our gain staging, drum bus EQ, and see if there's any issues that we need to deal with in the drum bus. Yeah, so there's a little bit of mid-range buildup here. I'm hearing it mostly in the tail of the kick. I just am not loving what that's doing. And then the fundamental, I think, is probably good. We can leave it be. Yeah, gain stage that move here really quick. Okay, so minus 22 at that. So we are adding just a touch. Not that much. Barely anything. All right, so now we are on to drum effects. The first drum effect that's going to almost automatically level up our drums is saturation and distortion. This is going to add additional thickness and also additional just sonic harmonic information that just sounds great with drums. I had a very, very difficult time mixing my drums until I started adding saturation and distortion to the drum bus, because that is just so characteristic of that drum sound that you're used to hearing on Spotify or wherever you listen to music. After saturation and distortion, we have reverb. And reverb is a very interesting topic when it comes to drums, because there's approved reverbs, which is plate reverb and chamber reverb. And the reason that these are the approved reverbs is that there are no early reflections when it comes to these types of reverbs. These are basically made up reverbs that don't really exist in real life, in terms of we don't hear this in everyday life. A plate reverb is literally a metal plate that we attach electrodes to produce sounds, which then creates this reverb effect. Chamber reverbs are where we're actually sending a signal from a recorded snare, say, and then we're sending it to a speaker that's in an attic, and then we have a mic on the other side of the attic that's then picking up that reverb. So there's essentially no early reflections, because it's just one single chamber that's picking up all the sound all at the same time. Technically speaking, there are early reflections in chamber, but functionally speaking, there are no early reflections in either of these reverbs, and they're very safe to use with drums if we want to add some drum reverb, specifically with our snare. All right, so the next one that we're going to be diving into is the drum room effect. So in our drums that we don't have a room, which is a great way to just add more thickness, just kind of bring the whole drum kit to life. And so if we don't have those drum rooms, we can actually create a drum room for ourselves by using this effect. Talking about how to set up the drum room, this is our generic setup that we have. So all of our kick, snare, toms, overheads, all that stuff is going to the drum bus, which is then going to our mix bus. So we're going to add another bus here that's going to create this drum room effect. So this is now the drum room. So we send all of our individual items, including the overheads, to the drum room, which the drum room is then going to be processed and then sent back to the drum bus, essentially creating another track that doesn't actually exist in our mix, but it can exist because we're able to create it. And then inside of the drum room, we're going to have our drum tracks obviously going to this room, which is going to be a room reverb. So we want to intentionally use a specific room reverb, because this is going to emulate a real space that we're used to hearing, like a studio, a live room, something similar to that. There are two types of reverbs that exist in the DAW and plugins. And these are algorithmic versus convolution reverbs. So algorithmic reverbs is essentially, as the name would imply, it's just an algorithm. It's taking in sound and then as an algorithm to then produce some sort of reverb on the back end that is meant to loosely relate to a real life space, versus convolution reverbs are actually where an acoustician actually goes to a room like a church or a hall or even a generic studio room, and they will measure different signals coming out of the speaker, and then they measure the signal in various areas of the room to essentially create a reverb using a real life space. So convolution reverbs are way more CPU intensive, so they're going to use more energy from your computer to actually run them, but they're also much more accurate when it comes to these types of reverbs. And in this case, we always want to use convolution reverbs if we have access to them. Logic even has some stock options, so if you're using Logic, you're in luck. We already have those inside of our stock suite of plugins. reverbs that you do not want to use in this case are plate reverbs or chamber reverbs. Again, because these don't have early reflections, part of the whole point of adding this room reverb is to make it sound like it's in a real room, in a real space. And so these would actually not benefit us because they don't have those early reflections, and therefore they don't actually emulate a real space. Rooms to use is a room reverb or a hall reverb. I always lean towards room reverbs. They are the safest option by far. Halls tend to be a little bit too big and too boomy. So if you have a very empty mix, it can be a good option. But if you have a thick mix like the one that we have, we definitely want to be leaning into that room. And it's also what we're used to hearing. So it's going to sound the best with our drums. And then we're going to send that to a thickness type compression that's very, very aggressive. And so this is going to completely blow my 3 decibel rule out of the water in terms of we're only going to compress 3 decibels at a time. However, it's acceptable because the rest of the drums, the main drums, are not being compressed with this compressor. This is just an additional drum bus room, an additional room mic, essentially, that's going to just add additional thickness. So it's kind of like using this in parallel, although we have this obviously reverb in front of it to change the characteristic of it. And then after that, we're going to be sending that to the drum bus to be further processed by the drum bus to unify this room with the rest of the bus and ultimately create a really awesome sounding, lively drum mix. All right, and so now we are on to effects. And so effects is very interesting when it comes to synthetic drums of all sorts because, you know, it's not really like meant to emulate a real space or anything. It's not like a real live drum kit that we're trying to make sound more real or avoid removing realness out of it, where they can really benefit from like this live feel. But I'm going to argue that most drums could use some sort of live element, live feel, and it's going to sound more just real to us. It's going to sound more vibrant overall. So here is the drum room for synthetic drums. So again, just like normal, we're going to add our additional bus and then bus that back to the drum bus. Now we're going to be adding our room reverb. Again, we're going to be using a convolution reverb, not a algorithmic reverb. And let's go ahead and look for a good room to use. Let's try the drum booth. Oh, that makes it sound so big. I love it. Let's go to recording room. I like it, but there's kind of a weird resonance in the mid-range. Yeah, I think that was it. So I'm just going to do some gentle slopes here, high and low pass. And so now we're going to add our compression. Again, let's reach for this classic VCA to a high ratio. All right, and that is everything that I'm gonna do on this drum bus. Let's just slowly mix it in. Yeah, this just sounds so much more alive and vibrant. So here's in the context of the mix. Again, this is very subtle. However, it just adds that extra little layer of just energy and liveness to the drums. I'm hearing it mostly in the hi-hat, so you can hear that just like little itty bitty tail of reverb. All right, and then the last thing that we want to do is add a little bit of distortion to this. I'm just gonna add some tape to the very end of this chain. Actually, let's add it right before the EQ. Using peak volume to gain stage this, we're at -6 without, -6.9, so we can actually gain that back up about a decibel. I really like this tape. It's just makes it so much thicker and just heavier without really sacrificing that much from the punchiness.